Of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Christ is risen. Christos anesti. While most of us, no doubt, take it for granted in our lives, light is critical to our survival and the survival of our planet. I did a little research for my sermon to discover what light does, why we need it. There may be more reasons we need light, but I discovered 4 that seem particularly important. First, light that hits us causes our bodies to produce vitamin D, which helps in the absorption of various minerals, helps bones grow properly, and can fight off breast cancer, colon cancer, prostate cancer, heart disease, depression, and weight gain, to name a few. Secondly, light is necessary for photosynthesis, right? Without which plants would not produce oxygen and life would die out on our planet. Third, the source of all food is light. Again, through photosynthesis, plants grow and become food, right? Indeed, in some sense, everything we eat was once light. With the fruits and veggies, the connection is clear. But if the fruits and veggies weren't there, all the animals that eat the fruits and the veggies wouldn't be there. And by extension, all the animals that eat the fruits and the veggies wouldn't be there. Lastly, without light, the earth would be completely cold and dark, as even the moon gets its glow from reflecting the sun, as we know. Light is important, to say the least. But more so even than the light of the world, which we've established is important, the light of the knowledge of God is infinitely more important. The light of the sun helps us get through this life, but has nothing to offer us when this life ends, right? But the light of the knowledge of God has much to offer us both in this life and even much more in the age to come. Why do I share these thoughts with you today? Because today we read the gospel story of Jesus giving sight to a man who was born blind. And there's a noteworthy theme in this story of light, right? The physical light that is restored to the eyes of the blind man, and also the spiritual light that some in the story are eager to receive and others not so much. Right at the start of this reading, Jesus tells us about himself in terms of light. Quote, "As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world." In today's gospel reading, there are basically 3 parties who see the light being Jesus, and react in varying ways to the light of Jesus. They are the blind man, the Jewish leaders, and the parents of the blind man. I think we can learn something today by looking at each of these 3 parties and seeing how they react to the light of Jesus Christ. First, the parents of the blind man. We're told in the scriptures that the Jewish leaders didn't believe that the man was blind, so they called for his parents to confirm that he was in fact born blind. We read, quote, "His parents answered, 'We know that this is our son and that he was born blind, but how he now sees we do not know, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him, he is of age, he will speak for himself.'" The reading also tells us that they did this because word had gotten out that if anyone were to say that Jesus was the Messiah, they would be thrown out of the synagogue. They would be excommunicated from the Jewish religion. What do we see here? They're not against Jesus, as were the Jewish leaders, who we'll talk about more in a second. Nor are they for Jesus, right, as the blind man clearly was. For them, Jesus is just too much trouble, right? Jesus was a problem that they frankly didn't want to get entangled in. I think of the parable of the sower, right? Where the farmer threw the seeds on the 4 different soils, right? The path, the rocky ground, the thorny bush, and then the good soil. And here's what Jesus says in particular about the rocky ground and why it didn't bear fruit. He says, quote, "When trouble or persecution comes because of the word, they quickly fall away." So brothers and sisters, that's the parents. Those who fall away because the light of Jesus is simply too problematic for them. Second, we have the leaders of the Jewish people, the Pharisees, the Sadducees. Here we see an interesting progression. If you look at the story carefully, you see sort of three movements in the attitudes of the Jewish leaders. And each movement, I might add, is nastier than the previous one. First, they accuse Jesus of being a sinner, for breaking the Sabbath by healing on the Sabbath, which was against the Jewish law. Quote, "Some of the Pharisees said, 'This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath.' But to that, the formerly blind man explains that God doesn't hear the prayers of sinners. And so, if God heard Jesus' prayer, their accusation can't be true, right? So they get a little meaner and accuse the man and Jesus of staging a hoax, right? By proposing that the man had never been blind in the first place. Sadly, for the Jewish leaders, the parents of the blind man, as we just said a minute ago, witness to the fact that this is in fact their son and that he was in fact born blind. Finally, after failing in 2 attempts to discredit Jesus, the Jewish leaders do, and this I think is interesting, they do what people with power and weak arguments have done from the beginning of time. They throw the man out, right? They answered him, "You were born in utter sin, and would you teach us?" And they cast him out. So the parents represent those who fall away because the light of Jesus is potentially too disruptive to their lives. And the Jewish leaders represent those who hate the light, right? And want nothing to do with the light. And if they can, even want to put the light out. Finally, we come to the hero of our story today, the man who was born blind. And just as there was a progression with the Jewish leaders, from mean to really mean to outright evil, there is also a progression with the man born blind. The reading tells us that first, when asked about this miracle, the formerly blind man says the following, quote, "The man," keyword, "the man called Jesus, made clay and anointed my eyes and said to me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' So I went and washed and received my sight." So Jesus starts out to the blind man as a man. But a little later, as the Jewish leaders continue their interrogation, the man makes a different claim about Jesus. We read, quote, "So they, the Jewish leaders, again said to the blind man, 'What do you say about him since he has opened your eyes?' He said, 'He is a prophet.'" He is a prophet. So Jesus has changed in the mind of this man from just being a man to being a prophet, which, it might be helpful to add, means that Jesus was a messenger of God's will. That's what a prophet was. But that's not the end yet. Finally, after the man is thrown out of the synagogue, the gospel relates the following. Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and having found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" He answered, "And who is he, sir, that I may believe in him?" Jesus said to him, "You have seen him, and it is he who speaks to you." He said, "Lord, I believe." So while the parents of this man are neither hot nor cold, they just want to get rid of the trouble in front of them, right? They don't want to be entangled in this problem. And the light of Jesus takes the Jewish leaders from bad to worse, right? For the hero in our story, right, the blind man, not only does he gladly receive the light of his eyes, right, the light of creation, but he also, and with equal joy, receives the light of the gospel of Christ. I mentioned at the beginning of my sermon that I could find 4 functions that sunlight has in the world we live in. Well, today's gospel, brothers and sisters, shows us that the light of Jesus Christ can also have multiple functions. It can do multiple things. It can, like the parents of the blind man, be something that we're not against, but we're not for either. Give me a little, but not too much. I don't want to look weird for Jesus. I just want to fit in and have Jesus, right? It can, like the leaders of the Jews, fill us with hatred. It can be something that that convicts us, shows us where we need to make repairs in our lives, and maybe we don't want to do that. It's easier to just put the light out, right? To extinguish the light and keep on being what I want to be, free of the trouble of Jesus in my life. Or lastly, brothers and sisters, it can be light that gives life. That, like the blind man in our reading, brings us ever to a clearly and more accurate understanding of who Jesus really is and what role he needs to play in our lives. May that last function, right, the one that we see in our hero today of receiving and accepting and being changed by the light of Christ, may that be the function that we also struggle every day in our lives to give to that light of Jesus Christ. Amen.